Hong Kong stood on the brink of total transformation.
History remains etched within these modern glass towers.
Luxury met the cold reality of impending war.
A Black Christmas marked the start of occupation.
By the early 1940s, Hong Kong had become one of the most important trading ports in the British Empire's Far Eastern network. A crowded colonial city shaped by commerce, culture, and an unspoken tension that hung over everything like the humid subtropical air. Within weeks, this entire world would collapse under Japanese invasion, transforming the colony into an occupied territory for 3 years and 8 months. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic photographs, paintings, and archival images to life, shifting perspective, changing camera angles, and moving through these scenes in ways their original creators never could. The goal is not just to look at the past, but to step into it, to move through Hong Kong as it once was, and imagine what it might have felt like to walk these streets in those final days of peace, when the Christmas decorations were going up and no one quite believed the war would actually arrive. And if you stay until the end, we will compare these same locations to how they appear today, to see what time has changed and what still remains. Before we set foot in the old Hong Kong of 1941, it helps to understand how this story began. The British had occupied Hong Kong Island a century earlier, following the First Opium War, transforming a sparsely populated fishing settlement into a bustling colonial port. By 1898, they had extended their control to the Kowloon Peninsula and the New Territories through a 99-year lease. What followed was decades of rapid development as the colony grew into a vital trading hub connecting Europe with China and the rest of Asia. By 1941, Hong Kong's population had swelled to approximately 1.6 million people, many of them refugees, who had fled the ongoing Sino-Japanese War on the mainland. The city they arrived in was a study in contrasts, where Victorian architecture stood alongside Chinese shophouses, and where the rigid hierarchies of colonial society played out against the backdrop of an increasingly uncertain world. The harbour that stretches before us now was the lifeblood of colonial Hong Kong. Victoria Harbour earned its name from the British Queen who reigned when the colony was established, and by 1941 it had become one of the busiest ports in Asia. Ships from Europe, America, and the Caribbean crowded its waters, unloading cargo onto the wharves, while passengers disembarked into a city unlike any they had known. The harbour served not merely as a commercial gateway, but as the stage upon which Hong Kong presented itself to the world. Junks and sampans wove between larger vessels, operated by tanker boat people whose families had lived on the water for generations. The deep, sheltered waters that had attracted the British in the first place continued to serve their purpose magnificently, allowing vessels of all sizes to anchor safely while conducting their business. For those arriving by sea, Victoria Harbour was Hong Kong, a dramatic introduction to a city that seemed to rise directly from the water, its buildings climbing the steep slopes of the island behind. On the Kowloon side of the harbour stands the Peninsula Hotel, which by 1941 had established itself as the finest hotel east of Suez. The hotel had opened its doors in 1928, built by the Kadoorie family with the intention of creating something exceptional. From its inception, the peninsula became the social heart of colonial Hong Kong, hosting Sunday concerts, nightly dinner dances, and the legendary afternoon tea service that attracted Hong Kong's elite and visiting celebrities alike. The lobby, designed in an Italianate style with Edwardian and Second Empire influences, featured ornamental stained glass, intricate woodwork, and luxurious carpets that transported guests into a world of refined elegance. By the early 40s, the peninsula had welcomed guests ranging from Charlie Chaplin to members of European royalty. No one walking through its grand lobby in December 1941 could have imagined that within weeks, this very building would serve as Japanese military headquarters and that the British governor would surrender the colony on its third floor. Just steps from the peninsula stands the clock tower, all that remains today of the former Kowloon Canton Railway terminus. In 1941, however, the entire station complex was still intact, a handsome Edwardian structure that served as Hong Kong's gateway to mainland China. The railway had been inaugurated in 1910, connecting the colony to Guangzhou and from there to cities throughout the vast Chinese interior. The clock tower itself, completed in 1915 and built of red brick and granite, rose 44 meters into the sky, becoming one of the first landmarks that arriving travelers would see. For countless immigrants and refugees, this station represented the threshold of a new life, the point where the chaos of war-torn China gave way to the relative stability of the British colony. Trains departed regularly for the north, though by December 1941, the route had become increasingly precarious as Japanese forces tightened their grip on southern China. We cross Victoria Harbour now aboard the Star Ferry, that most iconic of Hong Kong's transportation links. The ferry service had been operating since 1888, when a Parsi merchant named Dorabji Naoroji Mitaiwala established what would become an indispensable connection between Kowloon and Hong Kong Island. He had originally bought a steamboat, simply to transport bread and workers for his bakery, but quickly recognized the business potential of carrying passengers across the harbour. By 1941, the Star Ferry Company had a fleet of 6 vessels, their green and white hulls a familiar sight, crossing the harbour at all hours. The company had made history in 1933 by launching the Electric Star, the first diesel-electric passenger ferry of its kind anywhere in the world. The crossing took only minutes, yet it transported passengers between 2 distinct worlds. The ferry maintained a class system that reflected colonial society, with the upper deck reserved for first-class passengers, often Europeans and wealthy Chinese, while the lower deck served everyone else. The fare was modest, just a few cents, yet the service it provided was essential to the daily functioning of the city. As we make this crossing, the skyline of Hong Kong Island rises before us, a mixture of Western commercial buildings and Chinese shophouses ascending the steep hillside toward the peak. Arriving on Hong Kong Island, we find ourselves in the heart of the city of Victoria, though by 1941, most residents simply called it Central. The area served as the commercial and administrative center of the colony, home to the major trading houses, banks and government offices that drove Hong Kong's economy. Queen's Road ran through the district, lined with buildings that represented nearly a century of British presence. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation had its headquarters here, alongside the offices of legendary trading companies like Jardine Matheson, whose influence had shaped the colony since its founding. Rickshaws and sedan chairs still shared the streets with motorcars, though the latter were becoming increasingly common among the European population. The air carried the mingled scents of incense from nearby temples, cooking from Chinese kitchens and the salt tang of the harbour. It was a place where East and West met in constant, sometimes uneasy negotiation. Rising above the city is Victoria Peak, the highest point on Hong Kong Island, and in 1941, the most exclusive address in the colony. The peak had been developed as a residential area for Europeans beginning in the mid-19th century, valued for its cooler temperatures and the spectacular views it commanded over the harbour. A controversial ordinance had formally reserved the peak for non-Chinese residents between 1904 and 1930, though even after its repeal, the area remained largely European. The governor himself maintained a summer residence here, known as Mountain Lodge, where he could escape the oppressive summer heat of the lower city. Access came via the Peak Tram, a funicular railway that had been operating since 1888, carrying passengers up the impossibly steep slope in a journey that seemed to defy gravity. The tram maintained its own class distinctions, with the first two seats perpetually reserved for the governor, marked by a bronze plaque that reminded ordinary passengers of their place in the colonial hierarchy. From the summit, one could see the entire harbor spread out below, the new territories stretching toward China in the distance, and on clear days, the mountains of Guangdong province. It was a view that conveyed both the beauty and the vulnerability of the colony, surrounded as it was by Japanese-occupied territory. On the southern side of Hong Kong Island, we find Repulse Bay and its famous hotel. The Repulse Bay Hotel had opened in 1920, positioned as a luxury seaside resort that offered escape from the heat and bustle of the city. Built in the British colonial style with rambling verandas and gardens. Filled with fragrant flowers, the hotel attracted Hong Kong's high society for weekend getaways and elegant functions. By 1941, it had hosted countless distinguished guests, from European aristocrats to literary figures like Ernest Hemingway, who stayed there with his wife Martha Gellhorn in early '41, while reporting on China's resistance to Japan. The beach was one of the finest in the colony, though by December of that year, barbed wire had been rolled across the sand and pillboxes constructed at either end of the bay. The British military recognized the strategic importance of the location and had begun preparations for a defense that many still hoped would never be necessary. Guests continued to take afternoon tea on the veranda, but the war drums were growing louder. The gin drinkers line represented the colony's primary defensive position on the mainland side. Constructed during the 1930s at considerable expense, this fortification stretched across the new territories, designed to delay any Japanese advance from the north. The line consisted of pillboxes, trenches, and artillery positions, modeled somewhat optimistically on France's Maginot Line. British military planners understood that Hong Kong would be difficult to defend against a determined assault, yet they believed the gin drinkers line could hold attackers long enough for reinforcements to arrive or diplomatic solutions to be found. In late 1941, the line was manned by British, Indian, and Canadian troops, the latter having arrived just weeks before the invasion as a last-minute reinforcement. The soldiers who occupied these positions could see the fires burning across the border in China, signs of the war that was steadily approaching. When the attack finally came on December 8th, the gin drinkers line would collapse within days, far faster than anyone had anticipated. Kai Tak served as Hong Kong's airport, a modest facility on the Kowloon Peninsula that in 1941 represented the colony's connection to the wider world by air. The airport had been developed during the 1930s, reclaiming land from Kowloon Bay to create runways that jutted into the harbor. Pan American Airways had begun seaplane service connecting Hong Kong to San Francisco in the late 30s, and flights also linked the colony to cities throughout Asia. By December 1941, however, the Royal Air Force presence at Kai Tak was negligible, consisting of just a handful of obsolete aircraft that stood no chance against modern Japanese fighters. When the invasion began, Japanese bombers destroyed these planes within hours, establishing air superiority that would prove decisive in the days that followed. The airport that had symbolized Hong Kong's modernity and global connections became instead a demonstration of the colony's military vulnerability. The streets of Hong Kong in December 1941 presented a study in contrasts. Christmas decorations were appearing in the windows of Western shops, while Chinese New Year preparations were already underway in other districts. The European community maintained its routines of club dinners, cricket matches, and afternoon tea. even as news from the Pacific grew increasingly ominous. The Chinese population, many of them refugees from the mainland war, watched these developments with the perspective of people who had already witnessed Japanese brutality firsthand. Social life continued in the hotels and clubs, where conversation turned inevitably to whether war would come and what it might mean. Some families had already evacuated wives and children to Australia, though many had since returned, unable to bear the separation. The colony existed in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of normality while waiting for a catastrophe that many privately believed inevitable. The colonial administration, under Governor Mark, Acheson Young attempted to project confidence while privately acknowledging the precariousness of the situation. Young had arrived in Hong Kong only in September 1941, inheriting a colony that was surrounded by Japanese-occupied territory on three sides and dependent on the sea for its survival. The military garrison had been reinforced by Canadian troops, but the total defensive force of approximately 14,000 men faced a Japanese army of nearly 40,000, supported by overwhelming air and naval superiority. Intelligence reports suggested an attack was imminent, yet the rhythms of colonial life continued largely undisturbed. Government offices maintained their hours, courts heard their cases, and the bureaucratic machinery of British administration ground on. When the attack finally came on the morning of December 8th, catching the colony just hours after news arrived of Pearl Harbor, the transition from peace to war would be brutally swift. The Chinese population of Hong Kong, comprising the vast majority of residents, experienced colonial life from a perspective quite different from their European neighbors. Racial segregation, while less formalized than in some other colonies, remained a pervasive feature of Hong Kong society. Chinese residents were largely excluded from European residential areas, social clubs, and positions of authority within the colonial administration. The wealthiest Chinese merchants had achieved a measure of acceptance, with figures like Robert Hotung becoming the first Chinese permitted to live on the Peak during the 1920s. For most Chinese residents, however, life revolved around the crowded districts of Western and Sheungwan, where traditional Chinese life continued much as it had for generations. Tea houses served as gathering places, temples received daily offerings, and the ancient rhythms of commerce played out in narrow streets filled with shops selling silk, jade, and herbal medicines. When the Japanese invasion came, these communities would bear the brunt of the occupation's cruelty. Imagine walking through the lobby of the Peninsula Hotel on the afternoon of December 7th, 1941. The string quartet plays in the corner while guests take their afternoon tea, the bone china cups and silver service gleaming in the softened light. Conversation buzzes with speculation about the situation in the Pacific, the latest news from Washington and Tokyo. Outside, the clock tower marks the hour as trains continue to depart for the mainland, their passengers uncertain whether they will reach their destinations. Across the harbor, the lights of Hong Kong Island begin to twinkle in the gathering dusk, the Peak rising dark and magnificent above the city. In less than 18 hours, Japanese aircraft will appear over Kai Tak, and the world captured in this moment will begin its violent transformation. Standing here now, knowing what was about to happen, we see both the beauty of what existed and the tragedy of what was about to be lost. The Battle of Hong Kong began at dawn on December 8, 1941, and would last just 18 days. Japanese forces crossed the border from the north, quickly overwhelming the Gin Drinkers line and pushing British and Canadian defenders back toward Kowloon. The Japanese troops, battle-hardened from years of fighting in China, moved with speed and precision that caught the defenders off guard. By December 13th, all forces had been evacuated to Hong Kong Island, abandoning the mainland entirely. Japanese artillery and aircraft pounded the island relentlessly, while troops prepared for the amphibious crossing of the harbor. When Japanese forces landed on the night of December 18th, fierce fighting erupted across the island, with particularly brutal engagements at Wang Nai Chung Gap, where Canadian and British soldiers fought desperately to hold strategic positions. Company Sergeant Major John Osborne of the Winnipeg Grenadiers would earn the Victoria Cross for his actions there, throwing back Japanese grenades until one finally exploded before he could reach it. The defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, held out far longer than Japanese commanders had anticipated, but the outcome was never in doubt. On December 25th, Black Christmas, as it would forever be known in Hong Kong, Governor Young made the walk to the Peninsula Hotel to surrender the colony to Japanese General Sakai. What followed was 3 years and 8 months of occupation that transformed Hong Kong utterly. The Japanese renamed streets, required residents to bow to soldiers, and imposed a military currency that would become worthless by the war's end. Food rationing reduced many residents to starvation rations, and the population would plummet from 1.6 million to just 600,000 as people fled or were expelled to the mainland. The Peninsula Hotel became Japanese military headquarters, its elegant rooms occupied by officers, while the governor who had surrendered there was imprisoned first in the hotel itself, then shipped to a prison camp in Shanghai. The Repulse Bay Hotel, which had seen fierce fighting, served briefly as an internment camp before being converted to other purposes. Throughout the occupation, an estimated 10,000 Hong Kong civilians would be executed, with countless others tortured, raped, or worked to death. The colony that had seemed so permanent, so civilized, so British, had been reduced to survival. Now I want to bring you into the present and show how these places appear today. Thanks for being here, and if you have thoughts or requests for future cities, please share them in the comments. The transformation of Hong Kong over the past 8 decades has been nothing short of extraordinary, yet traces of that pre-war world remain visible for those who know where to look. The Peninsula Hotel still stands on its original site in Tsim Sha Tsui, though a modern tower now rises behind the original building. The lobby where Governor Young surrendered remains largely unchanged, still serving afternoon tea to guests who may not realize they are sitting in one of the most historically significant rooms in Hong Kong. The clock tower stands nearby, the only remnant of the railway terminus that was demolished in the 1970s. It has been designated a declared monument, preserved as a reminder of an era when trains, rather than aircraft, connected Hong Kong to the wider world. Victoria Harbour, once crowded with junks and freighters, now sees a different kind of traffic. Reclamation projects have narrowed the harbour significantly, and the skyline on both sides has been transformed by clusters of skyscrapers that would have been unimaginable in 1941. The Star Ferry still makes its crossing, though the journey takes less time now that the harbour is narrower. The green and white ferries remain a beloved institution, carrying tourists and nostalgic locals who prefer the leisurely water crossing to the efficiency of underground trains. The Peak remains Hong Kong's most prestigious address, though the demographics have changed entirely. The racial restrictions that once reserved the area for Europeans are long gone, and today the mansions on the hillside are owned primarily by Hong Kong's wealthiest residents and international investors. The Peak tram has been modernized multiple times, most recently in 2022, but the journey it offers remains essentially unchanged. From the summit, visitors look out over a city that has grown to 7 million people, its skyline one of the most recognizable in the world. Repulse Bay has been transformed from a quiet seaside retreat into one of Hong Kong's most expensive residential areas. The original hotel was demolished in 1982, though a replica of its famous veranda was constructed on the site, now serving as a restaurant. The beach remains popular, though the barbed wire and pillboxes are long gone. Luxury apartment towers now line the hillside where colonial villas once stood, their prices among the highest in the world. Of the gin drinkers' line, little visible evidence remains. The hills of the new territories have been covered with housing estates and infrastructure, burying most traces of the fortifications beneath decades of development. Occasional pillboxes survive, usually overgrown and forgotten, relics of a defensive strategy that failed so spectacularly in December 1941. The memory of the Japanese occupation has faded with the generations who experienced it directly, though it remains a sensitive subject in Hong Kong. Memorial services are held annually at sites where atrocities occurred, and the Stanley Military Cemetery contains the graves of those who fell defending the colony. The relationship between Hong Kong and Japan has long since normalized, with Japanese tourists now among the most numerous visitors to the city. History, as always, has proven more complicated than simple narratives of heroes and villains. Walking through Hong Kong today, it takes deliberate effort to see the city as it appeared in 1941. The scale of transformation has been so complete that even the geography has changed, with reclamation projects creating land where water once flowed. Yet certain views remain recognizable, certain buildings still stand, and in the right light, with the right frame of reference, we can glimpse the outline of the colonial city that existed on the eve of its destruction. The people who lived through those final days of peace, who took their afternoon tea at the peninsula and rode the Star Ferry across the harbor, could not have imagined what was coming. We, with the benefit of hindsight, know exactly how the story ended. Perhaps that knowledge allows us to appreciate more fully what existed before, to understand both its beauty and its fragility, and to recognize that the cities we inhabit today are no more permanent than the one that disappeared in December 1941. I do really appreciate you watching. Your ideas, input, and constructive feedback really do shape what comes next. Feel free to leave a comment below. Until next time.